August 26, 1346. Rain poured over a desolate field near the village of Crécy, turning the soil into a pit of sucking mud. Thunder rolled across the grey horizon as 9,000 weary English soldiers stood in silence, cold, soaked, and outnumbered 3-1. Across the valley, 30,000 French warriors assembled in dazzling splendor. Their armor gleamed like molten silver beneath the storm clouds. Banners of blue and crimson rippled in the wind. The air was thick with arrogance. The French nobles laughed among themselves, their polished helmets catching the faint glow of torches. They argued over who would earn the glory of capturing or killing King Edward III. Some boasted that by nightfall, the English king would be dragged through Paris in chains. Their laughter carried across the valley, blending with the restless snorts of war horses and the hiss of falling rain. But pride would soon turn to panic. 4 hours later, the field was silent except for the cawing of crows and the groans of the dying. 1,500 French nobles lay motionless, their jeweled armor buried in mud and blood. The Count of Flanders, the Duke of Lorraine, the proud lords of France, all gone. Their corpses were tangled in the bodies of their own horses, their faces twisted in disbelief. The flower of Europe's nobility had been cut down not by kings or champions, but by common peasants, with bows of yew and hands of callus and dirt. The English lost only 40 men. Not 400, 40. The contrast was so staggering that chroniclers called it divine judgment. In truth, it was discipline, patience, and genius. While the French charged blindly for glory, the English held the high ground, unflinching behind sharpened stakes and strings of wet, deadly silence. When the longbows sang, it was not music, it was execution. The arrows fell like rain, slicing through armor, flesh, and pride. Horses screamed. Knights clawed at their visors, trying to breathe through broken jaws. Blood mingled with rainwater until the field became a red river. By sunset, the storm had passed, but the ground itself seemed to breathe death. Crows feasted on royal flesh so rich they grew too heavy to fly. The wind carried the scent of iron and decay. And somewhere amid the corpses, the myth of chivalry bled out into the mud. That day, on a lonely field in northern France, 5 centuries of noble supremacy died, killed not by kings or saints, but by peasants with bent wood and string. After the slaughter at Crécy's opening fields, the world would soon learn that King Edward III was not merely lucky, he was dangerous. Weeks earlier, his ships had cut across the grey waters of the English Channel and landed on the shores of Normandy. His claim to the French throne came not through conquest but blood, through his mother Isabella of France, daughter of a French king. To the French court this was blasphemy. To Edward it was destiny. He brought with him 15,000 men, hardened archers, grim men-at-arms, and knights sworn by oath and hunger. They marched like locusts across northern France, leaving blackened villages and smoking towns in their wake. It was called a chevauchée, a scorched earth campaign designed not for conquest but humiliation. Edward wanted to prove one thing, that King Philip VI could not protect his own people. The message spread faster than the fires. The English were burning France itself to ash. Peasants fled through the woods as bells tolled in panic. Monasteries were looted, crops set ablaze, and rivers ran thick with soot. It wasn't war, it was exposure, the unraveling of France's illusion of safety. Each torch Edward lit was a challenge, daring Philip to stop him. Philip VI answered that challenge with pride and fury. He summoned the greatest army Europe had ever seen, more than 30,000 men, 12,000 of them knights in full plate. Their armor glinted like mirrors under the sun, their horses armored to the muzzle. Every noble family in France sent their finest. The King of Bohemia arrived, blind but unbowed. The princes of the Holy Roman Empire rode beside him. Even Moravian banners joined the parade. It was a gathering of crowns and egos, a spectacle masquerading as strategy. To the common soldier, it looked less like an army and more like heaven's pageant, an endless sea of gold, silver, and silk. Trumpets blared, drums thundered, and banners of lions and crosses rippled against the sky. But beneath the gleam was rot. Too many nobles, too many commands, and too much pride. Each lord sought personal glory. None sought victory. As the French host thundered north toward Crécy, its confidence was absolute. They would crush the English, reclaim their honor, and mount Edward's head on a pike before Paris's gates. But Edward was already watching from the ridges of Picardy, calm, calculating, and silent beneath the rain. He had lit France on fire not just to taunt his enemy, but to lure him into the trap that would end an age. The rain had not yet stopped when Edward's men reached the ridge near Crécy. The ground was slick, the air thick with the stench of wet earth and smoke from the burning villages behind them. To most commanders, retreat seemed the only sane choice. To Edward, it was an opportunity. The narrow slope before him, the marshy valley below, it was perfect for slaughter. He studied the land like a hunter studying his trap. The French army, swollen with pride and heavy with armor, would have to charge uphill through mud. Their horses would tire. Their formations would break. Edward saw the future written in the terrain itself. He turned to his captains and gave an order that froze them. "All knights dismount." A stunned silence spread through the ranks. English nobles, bred from birth to fight astride war horses worth their weight in gold, stared in disbelief. To fight on foot beside commoners was unthinkable. It violated everything chivalry stood for. But Edward's gaze allowed no argument. "Tonight," he said quietly, "we stand as one army, not as lords and peasants. We fight to live, not to boast." And so they obeyed. One by one, the nobles swung down from their horses and took their place among the archers. Men with torn clothes, scarred hands, and no titles to their names. The clink of armor against mud sounded like the breaking of an era. For the first time in 500 years, the knight's horse was not his weapon. It was his weakness. Edward's army took shape on the ridge. He arranged his longbows in a great V, their lines overlapping, so that every inch of the valley below could be struck by arrows. The archers drove sharpened wooden stakes into the ground, angled toward the oncoming cavalry. Pits were dug and concealed beneath straw. Every trap was set, every man in position. As twilight fell, Edward rode slowly along the line, inspecting his men. Rain ran down his armor in shining rivulets. He stopped beside a peasant archer, whose hands were cracked and blistered from the bowstring. "You've drawn a bow every Sunday of your life," Edward said. "Tomorrow, draw it for England." The man nodded, silent. Around them, torches flickered, casting orange halos on helmets and bows. The sound of thunder echoed across the valley, distant like drums of war. In that moment, Edward III, the king who dared to defy every rule of war, had forged something new. An army not of nobility or blood, but of discipline, unity, and defiance. And as darkness swallowed the ridge, the age of the mounted knight began to die. Night fell like a shroud over the muddy hills of Crécy. In the English camp, not a voice rose above a whisper. The rain hissed softly against helmets and canvas as archers worked by the dim light of torches, rubbing beeswax into bowstrings and sharpening their arrows with careful patience. Hammers clinked as wooden stakes were driven deep into the soaked soil, forming a bristling wall of death along the ridge. Others dug shallow pits and covered them with straw, traps for the cavalry they knew would come. King Edward III walked among his men, his golden cloak heavy with rain, his expression calm but unreadable. He stopped often to speak quietly to the archers, offering words of steadiness rather than glory. At his command, food and ale were passed around. Meat roasted over small fires that hissed in the drizzle. The men ate in silence, the smell of smoke and wet earth thick in the air. Their discipline was eerie, their composure terrifying. It was as if they already knew that tomorrow would become legend. Across the valley, a different world boiled. The French camp roared with chaos and vanity. Drums thundered. Laughter echoed through the night as nobles toasted to victory, parading beneath banners glistening with rain and pride. Horses reared and neighed. Servants polished armor until it shone like mirrors. Wine spilled, songs erupted, and wagers were placed on who would capture the English king first. They mocked the English for hiding behind trenches and stakes. Rats, they called them. Burrowing cowards. The fires of the French camp lit up the valley like a festival of arrogance. They did not see how the light betrayed their positions, how every glow became a target for English eyes on the ridge above. When dawn crept over the horizon, mist curled across the battlefield like smoke from the dead. The French nobles mounted their horses in glittering rows of silver and blue, their banners snapping proudly in the wind. But as they looked across the valley, their laughter faltered. The land before them was a wasteland. Villages blackened, fields burned to ash, the air thick with the stink of smoke and death. The English had left nothing untouched. Every ruined farm, every scorched church was a message. This is what your pride has bought. Fury surged through the French lines. Patience vanished. Honor demanded blood. And in the stillness of the ridge above, Edward's men waited, silent, ready, and unshakable, for the storm to break. By the time the French army reached the fields of Crécy, the sky had turned black with thunderclouds. The long march had broken their discipline. Horses limped, men stumbled, and armor hung heavy with exhaustion. King Philip VI rode at the head of 30,000 men, a river of silver and silk crawling across the valley. When he gave the order to halt and rest, his voice was drowned by the clamor of thousands drunk on pride. The nobles refused to wait. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavy, drenching banners and men alike. Philip's heralds shouted for patience, but no one listened. The French knights could see the English on the ridge, small, motionless figures against the storm, and they smelled glory. They were blind to the trap, deaf to reason. On the opposite slope, the English remained still. Edward III's command moved through the line in calm precision. Unstring your bows. Each longbowman pulled the wet string free, tucked it under his cloak, and waited. Their discipline was machine-like. Peasants and criminals united by training, not birth. They knew what the storm meant. A soaked string was a dead weapon. The Genoese mercenaries did not. 5,000 hired crossbowmen, soaked to the bone, shuffled into position ahead of the French cavalry. Their pavises, large wooden shields meant to cover them while reloading, were still far behind with the baggage train. They had no cover, no protection, and no understanding of what awaited them. When the order came to fire, the Genoese loosed a volley of bolts that barely reached halfway up the slope. The rain had slackened their bowstrings, halving their range. The bolts fell short, clattering harmlessly against English armor and shields. Then the English answered. 5,000 longbows rose in unison, their strings dry and taut. The first volley struck like thunder. Then came another, and another. 12 arrows a minute from every man, 60,000 shafts raining from the sky each minute. The storm of iron turned daylight into night. The Genoese screamed as the arrows tore through them. Without pavises, they were defenseless. Men skewered where they stood, others collapsing under their comrades' bodies. Those who fled turned back toward their own lines in terror. From behind, Count d'Alençon bellowed, "Cut down this rabble blocking our way." French knights spurred their horses forward, slaughtering their own allies to clear a path. In that moment, pride devoured reason. The greatest army in Christendom had turned its swords upon itself, not yet realizing it was already lost. The valley of Crécy had become a pit of mud, blood, and thunder. 12,000 French knights, driven by pride and madness, hurled themselves uphill into the storm. The ground shook as hooves pounded through corpses and churned rainwater into rivers of filth. Their armor gleamed for a heartbeat, then vanished beneath a black curtain of arrows. The first volley struck like a curse. Horses screamed, their eyes impaled, their legs shattered. Riders fell in tangled heaps, crushed beneath their own mounts. Behind them, new waves came charging, unable to stop, crashing into the fallen bodies before them. The field turned into a living wall of flesh and iron. Knights drowned in the mud, their armor sealing them inside their own tombs. The arrows didn't always pierce steel, but they didn't need to. The bodkin tips slammed into armor like hammers, breaking ribs, snapping bones, sending shock through the body. Men in shining plate flailed helplessly, their breath caught in their throats, their lungs filling with rain and blood. Still, the English line held firm. Their archers, soaked and mud-splattered, drew and released without pause. Each arrow loosed was another death sentence. When their quivers emptied, they didn't stop. They waded forward into the mire, pulling arrows from corpses, some still twitching, and fired them back into the storm. The sky was so thick with shafts that it seemed to rain steel. Amid the chaos came a sound unlike any other, the gallop of a king who could not see. John of Bohemia, blind for nearly a decade, had ridden to Crécy to die with honor. When his attendants urged him to flee, he replied, "The King of Bohemia does not turn his back to battle." He ordered his knights to tie their reins together so that he could ride with them. One last time, they rode into the tempest, 5 men bound as one. The blind king swung his sword at shadows, striking only wind and death. Arrows struck him again and again, but he never turned, never broke. When the battle ended, His body was found still tied to his comrades, sword in hand, eyes open. Edward's son, the young Black Prince, stood over the fallen monarch in silence. He saw not an enemy, but a relic of a dying age, a knight who had embodied chivalry's final breath. Moved by his courage, the prince took the king's crest, 3 white ostrich feathers, and his motto, Ich dien, I serve. That night, amid the corpses and mud, even victory felt haunted. For in the storm at Crécy, kings themselves had bled like men. By nightfall, the field at Crécy had become a graveyard. The rain had ceased, but thunder still rumbled in the distance as if heaven itself mourned. 16 times the French had charged, and 16 times they had been broken, shattered against the wall of English arrows and discipline. The valley was no longer a battlefield, it was a slaughterhouse. Horses lay in tangled heaps, their plated armor twisted like tin, their riders buried beneath them. The cries of the dying echoed through the mud. Armor creaked as men tried to crawl, only to sink deeper into the filth. The stench of sweat, iron, and death filled the air. Torches flickered across the ridge where the English held their line, exhausted. Silent, their faces ghostly pale beneath dripping helmets. At the heart of the chaos, King Philip VI himself had ridden into the storm. His armor, once resplendent in gold, was now blackened with blood and rain. An arrow pierced his jaw, knocking him from his horse. His guards dragged him from the field, kicking and struggling, desperate to rejoin a fight already lost. Behind him, the sacred oriflamme, France's banner of divine victory, was trampled into the mud, its crimson threads drowned beneath the corpses of those sworn to defend it. When dawn broke, a cold mist rose from the valley. What the English saw defied belief. The flower of France's nobility lay dead, princes, counts, dukes, and lords, their armor gleaming dully in the morning light. The Count of Flanders, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Alençon, all silenced forever. The arithmetic was obscene, 1,500 noble dead against 40 Englishmen. 1 English knight for every 750 French nobles. The math itself mocked an entire civilization. Edward's men stood among the fallen in disbelief. They had expected to die, not to destroy an empire. The longbow, worth 10 shillings, had annihilated armor worth £1,000. Steel and bloodlines, once symbols of invincibility, had been undone by wood, sinew, and patience. As the crows circled overhead, the truth settled like frost. Chivalry had died in the mud of Crécy. Birth no longer shielded a man. Valor no longer guaranteed survival. The nobles who had ruled by divine right were gone, replaced by the cold reality of discipline and distance. For the first time in history, common men had killed kings. And in that dawn light, beneath banners soaked in blood, a new world began to rise, one where courage alone could no longer save the proud. The morning after Crécy was too quiet. The rain had stopped, but the silence was heavier than any storm. Crows moved across the valley in dark clouds, so bloated from feasting they could barely take flight. They waddled among the corpses, picking at the jeweled armor of princes and the torn faces of knights. The once proud banners of France lay half buried in the mud, red, blue, and gold now dulled to brown. Weeks later, when farmers returned to their fields, their plows struck metal. Beneath the soil, they uncovered bones tangled with rusted armor, splintered arrows, and shattered crowns. The land was renamed the Field of the Cloth of Gold, not for its splendor, but for the way sunlight shimmered on the scattered remains of noblemen's gilded armor. France collapsed into chaos. Entire provinces were left leaderless, lords dead, their heirs buried beside them. Castles stood empty. Peasants looted what remained, wearing the jewelry of the fallen as trophies. The church prayed for souls that would never be found. The mighty chivalric order, the code that had ruled Europe for centuries, had rotted overnight. Yet Crécy was more than a victory. It was a revelation. It proved that the age of bloodline and ceremony had ended, that mathematics and discipline could crush arrogance and birthright. 5,000 peasants armed with bows of yew and discipline of iron had rewritten the laws of war. The longbow, worth 10 shillings, had slain kings and reshaped kingdoms. It taught Europe that innovation, not lineage, would rule the future. From that muddy ridge in 1346, the sound of arrows whistling through the rain echoed through history. But time devours even its own revolutions. Within decades, the longbow itself would fall silent before the roar of gunpowder. Muskets would replace muscle, and fire would replace skill. Yet Crécy's lesson endured. The world would never again kneel to the myth of noble blood. On that field of mud and bone, the Middle Ages took its final breath. The knight, once a symbol of divine power and romantic valor, died not in glory but in filth, face down in the rain, pierced by a peasant's arrow. The modern world was not born in a cathedral or at a coronation, but in that storm of arrows, 5,000 common men loosing death into the sky, proving that the future belongs not to the noble, but to the prepared.